Final Fantasy is one of the biggest video game franchises ever. Having been around since the NES days, the series has always been synonymous with grand, sweeping stories, the likes of which very few other properties have been able to come close to in terms of quality. And there's been more than a few Final Fantasy games that have gone down as generation and genre-defining classics. One of those classics will be getting a remake very soon, or, well, the first part of a remake at any rate, when Final Fantasy VII Remake launches on April 10. And in the lead up to that, we and millions of others have been looking back on the highs and lows of the series over the years. In this feature, we'll be taking a look at all the mainline numbered Final Fantasy games and ranking them from worst to best. So without further ado, let's get started. Number 16, Final Fantasy XIV, Original Release. Final Fantasy XIV came at a time when the series as a whole was perhaps in the worst shape of its life. Final Fantasy XIII had come across as something of a disappointment in 2009, and the fact that 14 was an MMORPG meant that quite a few automatically lost interest as well. It didn't help that when the game launched, it was utter crap, to put it mildly, thanks to being terribly unpolished, being ridden with performance issues, featuring an interface that was a nightmare to navigate, and core interaction, exploration, and combat mechanics that were an absolute chore. The original Final Fantasy XIV was perhaps the biggest misstep this series ever made. Of course, Square Enix did manage to turn things around, to the extent that Final Fantasy XIV as we know it today is probably one of the best games in the series, but we'll get to that soon enough. Number 15, Final Fantasy II. Like many other sequels of major titles in the NES era, Final Fantasy II deserves a lot of props for taking risks. On paper, a lot of its changes sounded excellent, from its darker, more focused storytelling to its unique progression mechanics to a system that attempted to make interactions with NPCs more engaging. However, most of these changes weren't implemented very well. The progression was easily exploitable and could turn the game into an absolute cakewalk, while the keyword system was the opposite of player-friendly, and instead of making NPC interactions more interesting, made them much more frustrating. The game does deserve recognition for introducing things that would become series staples, such as Cid or Chocobos, but by and large, it stands as one of the least memorable entries in the franchise. Number 14, Final Fantasy III. With Final Fantasy III, Square Enix went back to the first game's template, and that was both the game's biggest strength and its biggest weakness. It was strength because it allowed for smoother progression, better balanced difficulty, and as a result, more engaging battles. The introduction of even more series staples such as a job system and summons also elevated the game's combat, even though at the time those systems were a bit rough, which makes sense since they were in their infancy. However, the game's story was much more generic and forgettable, especially compared to its darker and more focused predecessor. Like 2, Final Fantasy III wouldn't see a Western release until many years after its original launch, but unless you're a die-hard series fan, this one isn't exactly unmissable. Number 13, Final Fantasy. The one that started it all. Final Fantasy I is one of the most important games ever made, not just for its series but for the entire genre, and even for the medium as a whole. By today's standards, the game is very hard to go back to, not least because it does little more than the bare minimum in almost all areas. But for its time, Final Fantasy was revolutionary. It brought back Squaresoft from the brink of bankruptcy and kickstarted what would become a veritable gaming dynasty. Purely as a game, though, it's not that easy or fun to go back to today, but if for nothing else than its legacy, Final Fantasy I deserves immense praise and recognition. Number 12, Final Fantasy XIII. Final Fantasy XIII is a classic case of a game that has lots of potential and sounds incredible on paper, but just doesn't manage to live up to all that potential. Its setting is rich and beautiful, but it's let down by an unnecessarily overwrought story and a very inconsistent cast of characters. It's got an engaging combat system, perhaps one of the best in the entire series, but a huge chunk of the game is incredibly linear, and as such, quite boring. There's still a lot to like about Final Fantasy XIII, from its beautiful visuals to the excellent soundtrack to the aforementioned combat, but by and large, it stands as one of the weakest mainline Final Fantasy entries. Number 11. Final Fantasy XI. Final Fantasy XI was a big departure for the series, an MMORPG in a franchise that had been exclusively single-player its entire life, and in a world where World of Warcraft hadn't yet been released. And while the game could be a bit dense and unfriendly to newcomers, as many of its dedicated fans would tell you, once you got past the initial troubles, Final Fantasy XI was a very rewarding game. Over the years, thanks to multiple updates and new content drops, Final Fantasy XI only became better and smoother, to the extent that it was eventually almost unrecognizable from the game it launched as. It might not be what you typically expect to see from Final Fantasy, but if you were into MMOs and into the series, 11 was an absolute treat back in the day. Number 10. Final Fantasy XV. Final Fantasy XV fell victim to a long and troubled development cycle, starting life as a PS3 exclusive Final Fantasy XIII spin-off called Final Fantasy Versus 13 in 2006. The game went through long periods of development hell, rebooting, and a mad dash to the finish line in its final stages of development after it became Final Fantasy XV. What we got as a result was a game with a lot of promise, one that hinted at greatness, but just couldn't get past its own development troubles. Final Fantasy XV has an excellent open world, a solid cast of core characters, and great combat, but it's let down by a lot of major issues. At its best, the story is an absolute mess, and downright incomprehensible at its worst, while the final hours of the game ditch two of its biggest strengths, the open world and the bond between Noctis and his three friends, as they see a solitary Noctis making his way through boring and linear corridors. It's a game of two halves, really. Final Fantasy XV would be a much better game if its second half maintained the quality of the first one. As it stands right now, though, it's still a good game, but a very, very inconsistent one. Number 9. Final Fantasy X. Final Fantasy X was the culmination of the series' turn-based era, and it certainly felt like it. It had a strictly turn-based combat system, which also allowed you to swap party members during battles on the fly, and a solid progression system, both of which made the actual gameplay a ton of fun. Meanwhile, the story, thanks to its beautifully rendered setting and a few standout characters, really stood out as well. Like Final Fantasy XIII, 10 was also a very linear affair, but unlike the former, Final Fantasy X actually used its linearity well. With time, some of the game's aspects that drew a lot of praise back when it first launched, such as the voice acting, have aged quite poorly, but overall, it's still a great game to go back to, especially for hardcore series fans. Number 8. Final Fantasy VIII. After a game as wildly successful as Final Fantasy VII, most companies would have made a sequel that just did more of the same. But with Final Fantasy VIII, Square Enix made a weird left turn, resulting in one of the most divisive games of the series. But we love it for how bold and unique it is. Not all of its ideas are executed well. The magic system is far from perfect, for example, but a deep and layered progression system, engaging battles, and a dense story. It was a game that, if you could get into it, would dig its claws deep into you and refuse to let go until the very end. Number 7. Final Fantasy V. For its first half-dozen entries, Final Fantasy would alternate between being story-driven and gameplay-driven. After Final Fantasy III, which was light on story but heavy on systems, Final Fantasy IV was a completely story-centric experience. Sticking to that pattern, Final Fantasy V went back to being gameplay-centric. And though it leaves something to be desired in the narrative and characters department, there's no doubting that purely as an RPG, Final Fantasy V is perhaps one of the best and most enjoyable entries in the series. It's got an incredibly versatile job system that lends a ton of strategy and replay value to the game, and makes every single battle an absolute blast. While story-heavy games in the series like 4, 6, and 7 usually make the headlines when it comes to this series, for many, the engaging and layered progression system of Final Fantasy V is one of the best things this series has ever done. Number 6. Final Fantasy IV. Final Fantasy IV is perhaps one of the most important and memorable entries in this series. Not only did it introduce the excellent ATB system, it is also the game that laid down the foundations of story-heavy experiences and epic, sweeping storytelling that the series follows to this day. Final Fantasy IV's epic tale of good versus evil and its strong and memorable ensemble cast of characters were nothing short of revolutionary for video games back when the game first launched. Unlike many games of its era, Final Fantasy IV has also aged very well, and it's still easy to go back to and enjoy. Number 5. Final Fantasy XII. No game in the series has benefited as much from re-releases as Final Fantasy XII has. Its original release was an excellent one as it was, thanks to its beautiful setting, its focus on exploration, its addictive battles, and an epic tale full of political intrigue, told through, let's call it fancy dialogue. With the Zodiac Age through, Square Enix successfully turned an already excellent game into an even better one, thanks to several smart improvements, from its job system, which improved the progression significantly, to the ability to fast-forward through battles. Final Fantasy XII is the very definition of epic, a game that was far ahead of its time when it first launched, and still stands as one of the best entries in the series. Number 4. Final Fantasy XIV: A Realm Reborn. When one speaks about cases of games that made remarkable comebacks after terrible initial launches, it's hard not to immediately think of Final Fantasy XIV, because the gulf in quality between the game's initial release and the relaunch of A Realm Reborn is startling to see. The first is the single worst-numbered game in the series, and the other one of the very best. Final Fantasy XIV is everything a Final Fantasy game should be, narratively dense with a beautiful and rich setting to explore, featuring addictive combat that is bolstered by complex and engaging progression mechanics, and that's barely even scratching the surface. What's even better is that with every single new expansion, of which there have been a few by now, Square Enix have consistently taken impressive leaps forward, to the extent that 2019's Shadowbringers is perhaps one of the greatest Final Fantasy stories of all time. Number 3. Final Fantasy IX. Though it started out as a fantasy series, as the name suggests, Final Fantasy gradually started veering into sci-fi territory over time. By the final years of the PS1 era, it had cemented itself as a sci-fi series, having shed its fantasy trappings almost completely. Final Fantasy IX was a throwback to the earlier days of the series, featuring a high fantasy setting, and for franchise fans, it's one of the strongest outings. And that's not just because it harkened back to the series' fantasy days, it's because it did it so well. From an excellent and rich setting with fantastic world building to a cast of characters that was full of weird, lovable, quirky personalities. From its open world exploration to its unabashedly classical combat and progression. Final Fantasy IX was a dream come true for fans of the series and of the genre. Hopefully, we'll see Final Fantasy returning to that style once again not too long from now. Number 2. Final Fantasy VII. Final Fantasy VII is perhaps the single most iconic game in the entire series, and not only is it synonymous with classic RPGs, but also with the PlayStation brand, and that generation of consoles as a whole, and it's not hard to see why. An excellent cast of characters, a spectacular villain, a story that twists and turns almost constantly and refuses to get its claws out of players, an absolutely fantastic soundtrack. There is no end to the things that Final Fantasy excelled at and set the bar for. The upcoming remake has a lot to live up to. Number 1. Final Fantasy VI. What can we say about Final Fantasy VI that hasn't already been said a million times? It is regarded to this day as not only one of the greatest Final Fantasy games ever, not just one of the greatest RPGs of all time, but quite simply one of the greatest games ever made. And even now, so many years after its release, it is still hard to argue with all that praise. Final Fantasy VI is a masterpiece. There's no two ways about it. It boasts one of the best stories the series has ever told, bolstered by excellent excellent world building, a magnetic villain, and a strong cast of main characters. Exploring the world is an absolute treat, thanks to the map being large and littered with memorable side content. And the second half of the game kicks off with an absolutely genius turn in the story, which energizes and refreshes the entire experience more than enough to keep players hooked right to the end. It is the crowning achievement both of this series and of Square Enix, and it's highly unlikely we'll ever see either of them reaching these heights ever again. That's not a diss on the franchise or the developer, but rather a testament to the timeless and impeccable quality of Final Fantasy VI.
And that about does it for this video. If you enjoyed what you watched and want to see more from GamingBolt, please hit the subscribe button. Also, don't forget to switch on the notifications bell icon next to it. That way you'll never miss any of our videos. Thanks for watching.